In this video, I'm going to tackle a whole new topic. Why were witches burned? And this is part 1, a brief history of witch burning. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I'm even talking about this topic, which is really unusual for me. Then I'm going to get into a little bit of the history of witch burning. We're going to talk about where they took place, how it was done, who did it. And then I'll wrap it up on this video and lead into part 2, where I'll talk about some of the myths and insights on witch burning and why it's relevant today. Okay, why am I even talking about this subject? It's not my usual topic, and it seems to be coming up a lot in my conversations with clients and with friends. And so I figured there's energy here, there's interest, there's intrigue. I'm certainly curious about it. And so I thought I would take this opportunity to dive into this topic, explore it, and even look at, why is this even relevant today? Why is this topic bubbling up to the surface, at least in my life, and probably in yours if you search this topic and are watching this video? Now, one of the reasons that the topic I think is coming up is because of this concept that's getting a lot of attention lately in biology, which is called epigenetics. Epigenetics is basically the study of how genes, how behaviors, how certain survival strategies get passed down from generation to generation. And within epigenetics, there's a study of trauma getting passed down and fears getting passed down and certain ways of being to avoid death or pain. What I've been coming up against lately, or not against, but what I've been witnessing lately is in the work that I do, especially with women, but not only with women, there's a lot of fear around expression. There's a lot of fear around being too big or being too bold or being too out there. And what I think it comes back to, or I think there's one thread that's related to witch burning. I think from an epigenetic perspective, it's very possible that there was fear that has been passed down, whether it's culturally or epigenetically, that holds people back, that makes them fear a witch hunt, for metaphorically speaking, right? Makes them fear, if I'm too different, if I'm too big, if I'm too loud, if I'm too good, whatever it is, then I might get attacked, I might get hurt, I might get burned at the stake, so to speak. And so that's why I think this is so interesting, because I feel that if we can learn about these things and understand them a little bit better, we can also claim our power back around them. So that's kind of the pre-frame or context around the topic and the way that I'm approaching it. Okay, so a little bit of history. First off, when did the witch hunts actually happen? Well, most of them took place between the 1400s and the 1800s. I know, that's crazy that it took place all the way up to the 1800s. They happened mostly in Europe, but also in the US. And actually, there's really a tradition of this type of thing, maybe not exactly with witches, that happens cross-culturally in almost every part of the world, every part of the planet. But the witch hunts that we're talking about from 1400 to 1800, around there, what's interesting about them, or what I find interesting, is that they were not a planned project or a crusade of any sort. It was really a phenomenon that took over Europe. It was not planned. It just kind of happened, and it spread like wildfire. No pun intended. There are these strangely universal outbreaks that happened all over the place, seemingly independently. And this was all heightened in 1485 when the Pope gave this friar named Kramer, I believe it was in Germany, permission to conduct inquisitions to find witches and root them out. He also published this book called A Hammer of Witches, where he described witchcraft, the dangers of witchcraft, how you could identify a witch with markings on the body, and all these things that were pretty much all made up. And interestingly enough, he singled out in the book, men and women could both be witches, but he singled out in this book women because he said they were weaker and hence they were easier targets for the devil to convert them to witchcraft. So this all sparked sermons and more books written, people talking about it. It was just part of the collective consciousness and unconscious at the time. What happened? How did this go down? How did this become practically implemented? Well, what would happen is, with all this belief now being fostered with all these books and all these sermons, people started to look for evidence of witchcraft. And what would happen is something bad would happen, some misfortune, a drought, a cloud of locusts, or a death of a baby, or something would happen, and people would look for someone to blame. Often it was some sort of outcast from society that was blamed, but it really could be anyone. So if there was someone who stood out a little too much, was a little too vocal, a little too different, a little too weird, people would look to that person. It was them that did it. Interesting to note that a lot of times people didn't actually say, okay, it was you. They would find somebody, but then they would take that person, they would torture them, and the goal was to get to a confession. And, torture is no fun. And a lot of times when people were being tortured, they would point the finger at someone else. So then they would say, well, it wasn't me, it was so-and-so. She did it. All right. So then they'd go find so-and-so. They'd bring her in and they'd torture so-and-so. And then so-and-so would say, well, this other person did it. So this is where we would end up with a whole bunch of different witch trials happening in one small community, because people would keep pointing the finger at each other. And the punishment was not always burning. In fact, a lot of times the punishment was a fine, and sometimes people didn't get burned or didn't get killed. Witches weren't actually usually burnt alive at the stake. Interestingly enough, they were usually hanged, especially in English-speaking countries, and then their bodies were burned. And the reason that their bodies were burned was because it was believed that they couldn't resurrect on Judgment Day if their body had been burned. So people ask, how many witches were actually killed during this time? Well, obviously the estimates vary, but it's estimated to be somewhere between about 40 to 60,000 people. And it may have been a lot more, but they're not, always records of these things. There's another really interesting reason that this phenomenon spread, and that's because the power of churches. So there was a time when people used prayers, incantations, herbs, all these things to find lost items, to cure people, to heal, to recover, all of this was all pretty normal. But what happened was there was a period during which the churches were losing their power, and they wanted to gain power back. And so one way they did that was to say, you can only do that through the church, and everything outside of that is evil, is bad. So actually the market, the competition for congregants and for people to give the church money was one of the incentives behind witch burning. Churches started to have competitions. Who could be tougher on witches? Well, look at all the witches we found last year. You should give us more money because we were such a good, we saved you, we protected you, right? So it was like marketing for churches to show how tough they were being on these witches. So part of the reason that this spread was very intentional by churches to be able to gain power and gain congregants from each other. In other words, witch hunts were ways to inspire loyalty and actually to generate money for the church. There's research even that shows that in areas where competition was fiercest, where, for example, Lutheranism was rising and the Catholic Church was losing, those are the areas where the witch hunts were the most intense. There's a lot of really interesting history here, and it's not always what it seems. In fact, I have part 2 of this video coming up, which is a lot more about the myths and the insights that we can gain from these witch trials. And you can watch that video right here by clicking this link.